Most of the next 3 videos are going to be based on research I did years ago, which I've tried to update. After all, a lot has happened in the last few years, but that hasn't been so easy since all the recent studies I've looked at seem to be missing the point. You see, as a society, we've gone crazy, and it turns out that crazy people aren't very good at introspection. So, if you just Google something like, "Are mental illness rates rising?" you'll get a lot of this. Suicides. They're up significantly, 50% in the last few years, which sounds like a lot, but the overall numbers are still low, and we've seen spikes like that before. Here's what we haven't seen. In 2005, as a police officer working in the state of Texas, my department took people into custody for mental illness because they were deemed an immediate danger to themselves or others so infrequently that none of us really knew the procedure. Every time we took them to the psychiatric hospital, which was something like once every 6 months for the average officer, we'd have to have the intake nurses walk us through the paperwork. 3 years later, the number of mental illness detentions, what were called APALs at the time, had jumped 1,500%. It went from something we almost never did to something we were doing constantly. And the entire profession changed. All sorts of new training, a host of new psychiatric hospitals trying to meet the demand, but that could never be built fast enough, and as soon as they were built, they were at capacity, then they were over capacity. If you pull up rising mental illness on YouTube, you get something like this, which actually isn't too far off. I mean, even before The Social Dilemma hit Netflix, I think most of us realized that smartphones and social media were having some pretty serious side effects on our culture. Now, search the history of mental illness, and you get video after video talking about the changes in treatment. How it went from drilling holes in their heads to Freud to modern medicine, while always ignoring the elephant in the room. Are we becoming mentally sicker than we used to be? And if so, how can we get better? I'm going to answer those questions. And I'm going to start with a brief history of our declining mental health. And yes, it is declining. And finish by answering the question in this video. How do we know it's declining? And how can we be sure? And we're going to start with this guy. His name was Richard Napier. And in the late Renaissance, he liked medicine and he liked reference books. And in the early 1600s, he toured Europe trying to create a reference work on all known ailments and their treatments. One of the ones listed he called mopishness, in other words, depression. What was the treatment? He didn't really know. You see, he said he'd heard of mopishness, but he'd never actually seen it close up. You see, the first thing to understand about the history of mental illness is that it's not just the rates of mental illness that have changed. It's also the type of afflictions. In the Renaissance, and in most of recorded history, when they talk about mental illness, what they're mostly referring to are developmental delays, either congenital or brought on by trauma. In the English-speaking world, these were collectively referred to with the pejorative term idiot, and they had standards for attaching the moniker, like if you couldn't speak more than 20 words, or if you couldn't say your parents' names, that sort of thing. The other was the sort of delusional thinking that would now mostly be categorized under schizophrenia, so grandiose thinking, like all the people in the early 1800s France who thought they were Napoleon, or so many of the various seers of the medieval period that could either be burned at the stake as witches and warlocks or exalted to the status of venerated prophet, just depending on the time and place. What you rarely saw was the sorts of things that fill up our psychiatric hospitals now, which we don't call mopishness anymore. We call them affective disorders, depression, manic depression, bipolar disorder. I actually found a French historian claiming that the set of symptoms that we now call bipolar couldn't be found prior to the 1700s. He's wrong. They can. And we'll talk about where before we're done with this series, because the environment that created those ancient cases is exactly the same as the one that's causing our modern spike. But for now, let's stick to the obvious. The spike isn't coming from an increase in congenital disorders, birth defects. And in large part, it's not even coming from your traumas like PTSD. No, it's coming from mental conditions that hinge on a person's expectations of the world. And these, it turns out, were very rare prior to the Industrial Revolution. People living in pre-industrial cultures didn't get blue at Christmas time. They didn't go into a midlife crisis, and in large part, that was simply because their expectations of the world and their sensitivity to life's usual dramas were very different from ours. Add on the close-knit nature of most of their communities, and you can start to realize why Napier had trouble finding actual clinical depression. They expected hardship back in those days. They lived their lives surrounded by it, and when hard times came, they had each other to turn to. And so, we see something of a trade-off. They died of famine, they died of infections and diseases, but they rarely became depressed because life wasn't what they expected it to be. In the 1700s, that dynamic began to change. The period of the late 1700s through the late 1800s is referred to as the Great Confinement, a period of a massive uptick in the number of people confined in asylums. For instance, in London, the number of asylums jumped from 16 to 40 between 1774 and 1819 and rose steadily throughout the 1800s. Most modern interpretations of this will say something like, it wasn't the numbers of mentally ill on the streets of London that were actually increasing. No, it was just that society had finally decided to care about its mentally sick. But make no mistake, the people of the time period didn't see it that way. London papers in the 1800s joked that the mentally ill would soon outnumber the healthy, which, according to DSM-5, has now come true, since it estimates that over 50% of the public now experiences acute mental illness at some point in our lives. So, back in the 1700s and 1800s, why was it increasing? Johann Riehl was one of the fathers of modern psychology, and his opinion on why the numbers had begun to increase was something I've seen time and time again. He attributed it to industrialization. Goodness me, industrial disease. Long hours, dangerous work, child labor, increasingly cramped cities. It made sense, but it was wrong. The numbers are hard to tease out after the 1800s for obvious reasons. World War I, World War II, the Holocaust, traumatic stress clouds the overall picture. But one thing is clear. In the 1900s, mental illness moved out of the cities and it moved into rural communities. Rates may not have been exactly the same, but the fact remains, by the end of the 1900s, we needed psychiatric care in the cities, and we needed it in the smaller towns too. It clearly wasn't being caused by factory work. Then came the early 2000s, and a bomb went off. You don't hear about it because the real measurements of this thing are things we don't keep nationwide statistics on, such as attempted suicides, and police responses to and incarcerations of the mentally ill. I told you at the beginning of this that law enforcement changed 15 years ago. I don't simply mean that it changed in terms of how many mentally ill subjects we took into custody. I mean, it changed in every regard, at every level of response, contact, and enforcement action. It changed as society changed. Just as an example, the way that we talk to suspects has now changed. When I first started in the 1990s, a good interrogation was one where the detective would lay out the benefits of confessing to the crime and effectively sell the offender on admitting to the truth. Now, a good interrogation is based on the offender's story, on their narrative, how they interpret events, and getting them to walk you through that narrative. I'll explain this more in the next video. For now, let's just explain the spiking numbers in the context of history. How do I know that Johann Riehl was right in substance, though not in particulars, and that we're not just doing a better job of diagnosing what was always there? And that we're not just adding hospital beds because we're so much more compassionate now? How do I know? Because we have a control group. We have communities that never took part in industrialization. And what happens when you give those communities those same diagnostic tests that show over 50% of us mentally ill at some point in life, 20% of us mentally ill at any given moment? You get a number around 2%. And those are mostly going to be congenital and trauma, with a little bit of schizophrenia. Probably around the same numbers that existed in Dr. Napier's time. I found a note I'd left for myself from my earlier research, pointing to a study done on a large group of Amish in Ohio. They were polled as to what psychiatric care they thought they needed. And the answer was, overwhelmingly, case management. In other words, they weren't opposed to the idea of psychiatric care if someone could just tell them what it was that they needed, because they didn't know. Ask an Amish person what their story is, and watch them stare at you blankly. They haven't been gazing at television screens all their lives, watching commercials, trying to sell them products by appealing to their vanity because, you're worth it. Now go back to the first part of rising mental illness rates in the 1700s and look at the other thing that was happening alongside industrialization, the rise of print media.
A lot of people think Google's just a search box and Facebook's just a place to see what my friends are doing. What they don't realize is there's entire teams of engineers whose job is to use your psychology against you.
There's a moment in The Social Dilemma, right around the 44-minute mark, where an unnamed insider, presumably defending social media, points out that this is just the next level in a series of informational platforms going back to print media, and he's exactly right. Industrialization brought with it mass literacy, fiction stories, and especially genre fiction. Stories focused on a person and providing a story arc, where that person was ultimately vindicated. And that's where this thing kicks off. I'll try and model what's happening inside our heads in the next video. For now, let me just point out, when we get to the 1900s, we see movie houses. We see radio. Then televisions. Each time reaching wider and wider audiences and reaching deeper and deeper into their lives. And so altering their expectations of the world and what their lives should look like. Then came the internet, and right behind it, social media. And now a constant stream of voices rewiring our brains to think that the world revolves around us and setting our expectations on a collision course with disaster. Richard Napier couldn't find mopishness, not because he lacked modern diagnostic tools. He couldn't find it because he was living in a time where people lived like the Amish. They lived in close-knit communities, characterized by mutual dependence. I need what you do, you need what I do, and these just naturally tend to foster closer relationships, as opposed to the modern I have my life, you have yours relationships. And he couldn't find it because they didn't think that the world was supposed to revolve around them. They hadn't been indoctrinated into modern humanist thinking and had that way of looking at the world drummed into them by presenting them with the humanist story arc, first in books, then in radio and movies, then in television, and finally through a world wide web that tangles us all in our social media echo chambers. And so we went from can't find it to can't look up without seeing it all around us. Next time we'll look at how this life as a story arc can have bizarre and disastrous consequences by breaking down the thought process that represents quite probably its most extreme form, the active shooter. And so see what happens when someone fashions their life as a narrative, in this case the story arc of an action movie, complete with villains who have to be gunned down en masse. Yeah, it's just going to get crazier from here. This is David Reichert from The Bunker. Hit like and subscribe and click the notification bell, and we'll try and put out at least one video a week. Also, our pandemic horror series, The Holocaust Engine, is available September 14th. Link for pre-order down below.